Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This month, we're talking to Amy Jeffs, a Somerset-based art historian and printmaker with expertise in medieval art and literature. In 2020, she gained a PhD in art history from Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, having worked at the British Library and studied for earlier degrees at the Courtauld Institute of Art and Cambridge. We're mostly going to discuss her first book, Storyland, but we do also chat about her most recent book, Wild, as well. But basically, we're going to be chatting about some of the myths in Britain's ancient past, and she will retell some of them for you as well. Whether such myths were seen as fact or fiction in earlier centuries, and the value of art to storytelling. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on here.
It's absolutely no problem. I've actually been reading both Storyland and Wild, so I feel like I'm quite well steeped in all of your work. And I know
Thank
Storyland's
you.
just come out in the US, hasn't it?
It has, and Wild's out next spring. They've done
Cool.
a beautiful job. Andrews McNeil, they've done the most lovely job of this beautiful hard. It's not got a jacket. The gold foil's embossed into the actual book boards, and it looks so good. And I think they'll probably do something similar for Wild, so I can't wait to see.
Excellent. So obviously people in the UK then will probably already have seen Storyland for a while in bookshops.
Yeah,
And
but the
in it you're sort of offering,
children's.
sorry?
I was going to say the children's version has just come out, 12th of October.
Oh, cool.
So there's a children's adaptation winging its way to schools all around the country and sort of giving kids a way into British myth and legend.
Excellent. And just in time for Christmas.
I know, what a coincidence. Yeah,
um,
well,
So for anyone who hasn't seen Storyland yet, in it you're sort of offering retellings of stories from like Britain's distant past, along with commentary to explain them. And what I was wondering as I was going through, because obviously some of them I was familiar with and some of them I really wasn't. So how did you choose which of the stories that you actually wanted to tell?
that's such a lovely question. Basically, I started researching Storyland, not realizing I was researching it. So I was doing a PhD on a English manuscript from 1340 ish, and it contained a text called the Brut, which is in Old French, which is the kind of origin myth of Britain. And I became really interested in the Brut tradition and started doing illustrations of some of the episodes in this story. So things like the goddess Diana appearing to a Trojan called Brutus and telling him he's going to go and found a kingdom in the Western Ocean, on an island in the Western Ocean that's uninhabited but for a few giants, and he will found a new Troy there. And this Brutus goes off and he founds his kingdom and he calls it Britain after himself, and the new Troy later becomes London, all this sort of thing. So I started illustrating them, and then I just got into this idea of illustrating Britain's mythic topography. So as a medievalist, I was looking at different saints' lives, chronicles, various things, and just finding moments that lent themselves to illustration and that pertained in some way to the landscape of Britain and had a kind of marvelous or exciting or very depictable moment in them. So I feel like a lot of people, if you say medieval chronicle, they don't think that's going to be the most exciting thing to read. If you and you can start trying to explain, but chances are their eyes will glaze over. They do when I in the back in the day when I try and explain, they would. But if you hold up a picture of a giant being thrown off the cliffs, they go, "Oh, interesting story." They know it's straight away. And so the pictures were what I was finding to be a really fun way of showing that the stuff I was encountering as part of my PhD research included stories that were timelessly good. So that's how it began. Things that could be illustrated. And then when it came to putting together a book proposal, I had this body of images, and then I started expanding the search. But then it was still by the same criteria. Let's find stories that are about British origins, Britain's origins, mythic ones. I wanted to encompass stories about the English, the origins of the English, the Welsh, Scottish. The Scottish stories inevitably or naturally included Irish origin myths. And I wanted the stories to be compelling and exciting and the kind of things that lent themselves to illustration.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that obviously these stories come from manuscripts and so on? How well known would they have actually been among the general populace? Sort of would they have been common, or were they sort of just the preserve of a few?
I just thought of a little follow-up point to the previous question as well, which is that I wanted to run chronologically according to the fiction of the legends. So I was looking for stuff starting as early as possible. So I begin before Noah's flood with giants in remotest Africa and run up to the Norman conquest of England. And I wanted there to be a sweeping super narrative, if you know what I mean. So that definitely came into it too. So we do know, while manuscripts were the preserve of the elite, and we can't often get a good idea of what majority of the people would have been listening to and telling in terms of stories, some of these tales do actually make their way onto the landscape itself. So for instance, the story of the giant Gog Magog, the last of the giants of Albion, wrestling a Trojan called Coroneus on the cliffs, that appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. Definitely an elite thing. It was the sort of prototype for the whole Greek tradition. Everything, all the translations kind of stem from this Latin chronicle written for the Norman elite. And it's got this moment in it where Brutus, the founder of Britain, has arrived in Albion. There's an indigenous population of giants that they clash with and defeat, and the leader is called Gog Magog. And Brutus tells his right-hand man Coroneus to wrestle Gog Magog. Coroneus is already famous as a giant killer, so they wrestle on the cliffs. Coroneus throws Gog Magog into the sea, and Geoffrey of Monmouth says, and now that's the place that we call Gog Magog's Leap, but no one knows now where Gog Magog's Leap is. But scholars have noticed that there are records of a big picture in the chalk of Plymouth Hoe. So Plymouth is right down the south coast of Britain, around the places where Brutus is, according to legend, said to have landed with his ships. And it's a kind of promontory that high point that looks out over the sea. And by at least the 15th century, there was a big chalk image of a man wrestling a giant on Plymouth Hoe. And it was destroyed in the 17th century. And so you do get a lot of, I mean, you only have to look at the big chalk picture of the Cerne Abbas giant, or note the fact that there is some hills in Cambridgeshire called the Gog Magog Hills, to know that stories of giants are associated with high places and hills in Britain and on the continent as well. And that perhaps the story of Gog Magog and Coroneus was known by the people of, at least of Plymouth, if not much further afield. The other answer I'd give to that question is that some of these elite medieval texts, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, have names for mortal legendary kings in them that seem to recall names that we know belong to Celtic gods. So, for instance, the king Belenus and his brother Brenius, they might have something to do with Beli and Bran, the Celtic gods that there is some mention of in the manuscript tradition. So, who knows? There's a very complex web of storytelling and oral tradition mixed with quite carefully composed literary tradition for an elite audience. That was a terrible answer. So what do you think?
No, I was really interested because I thought obviously look back with that kind of benefit of hindsight, and we're kind of like, well, we have access to these because we're used to like mass literacy. But then you think even in the 19th century, and I suppose before that, everything would have been based on oral storytelling. So that's where I was like, were these stories popular? Or were they just people writing them down as a way to like legitimize something?
Yeah. So there's, I think, a kind of chicken and egg thing going on, because some of the stories I include are legends about saints that are associated with particular shrines. And we know those stories instrumental in bringing in pilgrims and revenues for the ecclesiastical foundations that promoted them. Stories like King Arthur and the Grail around Glastonbury, or St. Kenelm at Winchcombe. And so we know that pilgrims who could come from any part of society were drinking in these stories and fired up enough by them to go on dangerous journeys across land and sea. You don't know to what extent these stories are just made up by the institutions that they aid, or how much the institution is seeing a kind of grassroots storytelling tradition and seizing it and developing it. Probably it's a mixture of all of those things, and vastly more complex than we could ever hope to express. But it's a really interesting thing to look into and to puzzle through. And I think I do a little bit of that in the book.
So I think, obviously, I was wondering, would you say stories and legends are actually helpful to historians, given there's all this background stuff going on that, you can never really know? That they kind of pass things along that are true wrapped up as fiction, or do they end up getting so adapted and evolved and so on, the more that they're retold, that they essentially make it quite difficult to get at what people truly thought or believed, or in fact what the truth of whatever that might be actually is?
Yeah. So I think stories like, I'm really interested in the Arthurian legend and how the model of the king with his barons who were unified around the round table, that was fictional. That was dreamt up probably in the 12th century or the 13th century, in fact. And it's set back in the 5th century. That was something that by the 14th century, the courts of Europe are consciously emulating because the Arthurian legend was so popular. The kings like Edward III of England are like, right, we need an order of knights. We need to, I mean, his granddad, actually, Edward I, had the round table built. They start emulating legend in the courts. I'm interested in how myth started, the kind of fantasy of political unity that could be expressed by myth, fed into political reality. I'm also interested in how so many of these stories are about belonging, and to what extent did they foster a sense of community across vast territories among the people that they pertain to. I mean, definitely with the story of Brutus, the English kings, the Norman kings, once they've conquered England, they seize on that myth very, very enthusiastically. A case in point about myth and history is that the relationship between the English and the Scottish. So at this point in the Middle Ages, these stories aren't perceived as myth. They are perceived as history. They have a different idea of what history is and is meant to be. Obviously, it's about the past, but things can happen like prophecies, and there can be goddesses and giants that maybe we wouldn't think of as authoritative history now, but this was accepted then. The English, in the late 13th century, the English king, Edward I, is claiming overlordship of Scotland. He justifies that claim by saying that the eldest of Brutus's 3 sons, so Brutus is the founder of Britain, Trojan, he says that the eldest of Brutus's 3 sons received the territory that would become England after Brutus died, whereas the other 2 sons received the territories that would become Wales and Scotland. And he says that as a successor of the eldest son, he therefore has the right to claim overlordship of the 2 kingdoms that were given to the younger sons. And he puts this in a letter to the Pope. And he's actually he brought together his bishops and abbots at the castle of Norham and asked them to find this evidence. And they went into their libraries and they came back with the Brute myth. And so then he puts in a letter to the Pope justifying his claim to suzerainty, as it's called. And the Scots respond by saying, well, that's irrelevant to us because we've got a completely different origin myth. And they, at that point, really bring together and solidify or crystallize an origin myth that had been circulating in Irish manuscripts about the Irish having, so the Scots descend from the Irish, the Scotti, that was the Latin word for the Irish, and they claim their descent from an Egyptian princess called Scota and a Greek prince called Gaithalos, who had travelled from the courts of Egypt during the lifetime of Moses and the exodus of the Israelites. And so they say, in response to the English thing about the eldest son and Brutus and the division of the land, we don't accept your claim to suzerainty because we've got a completely different origin myth. We're not part of your family of Trojans. That's your story. We came from Egypt under Scota. We traveled to Spain and then to Ireland and then across into northern Britain, which we conquered by superior military might. Therefore, we have a right to it. And we are independent from you and do not recognize your claim to authority. And this is actually put into the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, that sort of definitive document about Scottish independence. So the question of, there are ways in which these myths are profoundly relevant to history and remain relevant. Even if the stories are forgotten, that spirit, when you read the later chronicles, sort of the 14th and 15th century chronicles about where the Scots came from and their origins in Egypt, that ardent expression of independence, of freedom from foreign rule, of adventure and extremely illustrious origins. All of that's really rousing stuff to read in the medieval sources. And I think that spirit sort of endures, even if the stories aren't as well known.
That's really interesting. I think it's really funny when you think how it almost kind of ignores what we know of actual history, of going all the way back through it into prehistory and so on. And then people saying, oh, our stories doesn't even connect with yours. And it's like nobody's sort of necessarily disputing whether they're true or not. They're just going, this one's ours. And I think that's really interesting. Obviously, we can't really talk about these ancient myths and things without King Arthur, who you've already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And weirdly, I've only ever featured him on the podcast once, I think. And that and that was the legend where he's sleeping beneath Sewing Shield's castle. Try saying that quickly, in Northumberland.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying there about how the courts were trying to emulate his court and so on. But did ordinary people have much of an interest in King Arthur? Or would it have been something again reserved for courtly life? Because I'm not quite sure how widely spread these kind of stories would have been at the time.
I think that you can look to the Glastonbury pilgrimage. That was by the 14th century, that was extremely popular, but this amazing thing had happened in the 12th century, may or may not have happened. The monks dug up King Arthur's body in the cemetery of Glastonbury Abbey. Basically, they dug between two pyramids, as they were called, probably kind of obelisk standing stone things, sort of high crosses perhaps. They dug down, they found a hollow oak tree with two skeletons inside, and one of the skeletons belonged to a man, the other to a woman. The male skeleton was 7 foot tall and had its skull was so big that you could, like, the width of a man's palm separated the eye sockets. And the woman's skeleton still had long blonde tresses. And one sort of greedy knight apparently jumped down into the tomb and snatched up some of the hair, and it just disintegrated to dust in his hand. And they've got a lead plaque saying, "Here lies the body of King Arthur and his second wife, Guinevere," which is an odd little detail. And they, by the late 13th century, latter half of the 13th century, these bodies had been translated into a really magnificent black marble tomb right in front of the high altar at Glastonbury Abbey, like right slap bang in the middle of the most holy part of the church. And that was a huge draw for pilgrims and a huge claim for the Glastonbury monks to have the body of King Arthur and Guinevere. There was also I believe, a seal of King Arthur hanging on the tomb of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. And that was a relatively popular cult. It was a bit more of a top-down cult, but still. And so I think from the fact that these, I think pilgrimage sites and ones that were from such famous and massive institutions as Glastonbury really would have brought these stories to the general population if they didn't already know them. But I suspect they did, given the number of place names that pertain to Arthur and the legends of Arthur, and the fact that there is some kind of much older Arthurian tradition in the Welsh population. Like when that starts being written down in the 12th century, it's obviously not brand new. There's something going on coming from an oral tradition there. So it's a diverse population in Britain, and probably the story is different depending on where you look. But I think people would have known about Arthur and about those stories.
Because I know he went on to have sort of popularity much later, and I know I did cover him briefly when I did Edward Burne-Jones. Not a fan of his, if I'm completely honest, but that's a side issue. And obviously there's been umpteen like film and TV adaptations, some good, some not so good, about Arthur. But it seems like the focus is a little bit more on Merlin now, because I guess he is kind of the more interesting one of the two. So do you think, bearing all this in mind that you know about Arthur and his popularity in the past, is he likely to have another renaissance, or has he kind of lost his relevance, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the whole, we picture a white man, sort of benevolent dictator, not benign. Basically, it's something that maybe is not that woke, and why would we care now? What I think Arthur represents that still tugs at my heartstrings is this idea of a powerful and good and I think it's C.S. Lewis says in the Middle Ages you don't get subversive literature. You don't get literature that says we shouldn't have a king. We get literature that says we long for a good king. And Arthur is, for most of his reign, until he gets a little bit overconfident towards the end, he's presented as a good king of enormous sort of strength and authority, and he represents kind of security and peace. In the Welsh tradition, he's definitely a force that keeps out invasion. I think that dream of security for your family, that of a government basically that really looks after you, is not something that's dead. And I think Arthur is a symbol for that kind of security. So if you can kind of abstract him from tall white man on horse, and I mean there's these lovely stories of the hunt that he chases the boar Troint, and he's going over the landscapes of Ireland and what's now South Wales and into Cornwall, as if he's just galloping around a football pitch. He's kind of covering them in, on his horse with his barons. He is like this amazingly or supernaturally strong and all-encompassing of the lands of the territory figure, and it's like the two things mirror each other: the landscape of Britain and a little bit of Ireland there, but he doesn't claim, well, he does eventually claim Ireland. Okay, I won't get into that. That kind of strength is expressed by the landscape that he represents. So I don't know. I personally think we shouldn't dismiss Arthur as obsolete, that we should look to what it is that really stirred the medieval imagination about him, and actually realize that that's something quite timeless. That longing for security and for somebody that has got it under control and you're all going to be okay, whether that somebody is an individual or a whole government.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, and this is my understanding again coming from film and TV, did you have to somehow prove yourself worthy in order to be part of the Round Table?
So the Round Table really comes in the literature in the 13th century, and then it gets what most people think of when they think of Arthur is from the 15th century work by Malory, which draws a lot on actually texts that were French in origin, originally in French, but they have always been more interested in the earlier Welsh and sort of things written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was of course a Welsh cleric. He writes in Latin, like the Vita Merlini. In that there is no Round Table, and the knights are a lot less gallant, and it's not that whole Arthurian thing. When it first crops up in the Anglo, there's a version by Layamon who put the Brute into Middle English. He says that if you sat at the Round Table, it's not the Brown Table, the Round Table, you would feel such strong brotherly love for the other people at the table that you would willingly die for them. So I don't know what selection process there was for the peers, but certainly once you're there, you are utterly united. And I think that's what matters more. It's like, get some strong blokes, put them at the table, and then it's baronial unity that is again the fantasy there, because when you live in an autocracy where kings rule by hereditary right, there's every chance that a bit of a weak king will come to the throne, or he'll start showing favoritism towards certain barons, or barons for whatever reason might try starting to usurp the throne. That tension and that potential disruption and the risk of civil war is a constant threat in the medieval political system. So yes, I don't know about the selection process, but I don't know how much that mattered relative to the fantasy it espoused of that utter unity.
Yeah, I was just thinking if you did have to actually be decent at what you did, I thought that would be really lovely to kind of apply to modern politics now.
Yes. Yeah, but likewise, so would that kind of sense of consensus and like of concord, among harmony among politicians, perhaps. Yeah, it depends what they were trying to make happen. But yeah, it's a tricky thing trying to working out how much to apply I suppose that a lot of these stories have applicability to modern contexts, and I think a lot of them are relevant if you step back and look at their broader symbolic dynamics. But yes, we can also appreciate them with critical distance and not try and apply them to like too much to the modern day. I don't know, it sort of depends on your personal taste.
I think I thought that about the one with Cordelia and Lear, because obviously I was only familiar with that one from Shakespeare, and the idea that like she actually does a pretty good job until her siblings come along and decide to oust her. And I just kind of think, again, is it that thing of particular type of leadership is kind of not appreciated as much as just like land grab sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I just feel desperately sorry for Cordelia because she's like honest, and then it doesn't really end very well for her. And I just thought, oh, bless her.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely bit of irony. And in the book, I discuss how Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing in around 1136 at the time when the Empress Matilda was claiming the throne of England, which she was, direct heir to. And if she'd been a bloke, it wouldn't have been an issue. And but the barons sort of stand against her, and I think that Cordelia's sort of straight up honesty, her loyalty to her father, and her competence as a ruler, there is something really sad about the fact that it's basically underhand dealings and stirring up of rebellion that drags her from the throne just because she's a woman. But it's also maybe a sort of, Geoffrey of Monmouth is saying something like, perhaps honesty doesn't make it in power. It's a kind of House of Cards scenario where ultimately it's the Machiavellian ones that rule the roost.
That's quite sad, isn't it?
I don't know whether I think in the Shakespearean version where she just dies as soon as her dad realizes the mistake he's made, it's almost, well, it's not a mercy, because in the medieval version she gets to care for him and be reconciled with him and rule for 5 years. But yeah, it's not exactly a happy ending.
I think that's the thing with a lot of the stories, that they seem to have much more of an emphasis of actually, I won't say reflect in real life because we're not really plagued with giants and so on anymore, but it is that the human relationships don't tend to just be happy ever after ending even. It's like it does seem a little bit more realistic in that sense. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of. I'm thinking of the story of Brutus, and this really puzzles me. So there's Brutus at the beginning, the founder of Britain, and his right-hand man Coroneus, who throws Gog Magog into the sea. And then Brutus has his 3 sons, Locrine, Camber, and Albonac, who get England, Wales, and Scotland, or the territories that will become those countries. Locrine ends up marrying Coroneus's daughter, who's called Gwendolen, but he's not in love with her, but he's probably quite rightfully scared of her because she's a lot like her dad, and her dad's a famous giant killer. And so he has this lover. She doesn't love him at all, but he's got this woman called Estrildis, a German princess who he imprisons in a network of caves under London and keeps as his mistress against her will and with unbeknownst to Gwendolen. And then when Coroneus dies, Locrine plucks up the courage to bring Estrildis and now 7-year-old daughter into the light and tell Gwendolen that he's getting a divorce and he's going to marry his mistress. It doesn't say anything about how Estrildis feels about this, presumably absolutely incensed and very hurt. And Gwendolen goes off to the west, musters an army and slaughters Locrine, throws Estrildis and her daughter into the Severn. The daughter's called Sabrina and gives the Severn its name, and then becomes queen. And so the line changes because only the 3rd monarch of Britain is a woman, and she's the daughter of Coroneus. She's not blood related to Brutus. And so it should be like we're all the kings subsequent to her descended from Gwendolen, not Brutus, which it's always saying, and descended from Brutus. But actually, she's the one that changes the track at that point in the story. But it is harsh. And, but then Geoffrey of Monmouth says, and she reigned for 15 years and was a really good queen. And there doesn't seem in Geoffrey's voice anyway to be a great compulsion to moralize. He's not like, and it was really, really mean of her to throw the German princess and her daughter into the Severn when they hadn't actually done anything wrong. But nevertheless, she ruled really well. She was a great queen. And in some ways, it's like her brutality saved her in a way that it doesn't save Cordelia. But that's left for kind of us to infer. But
Gwendolyn had children with Locrine.
Oh, it probably says. Would you like, actually, it might be upstairs. Would you like me to get it and
No,
find out?
that was more
Okay.
just personal interest on my part because I was thinking, would it still have gone down through him via any children he had with Gwendolyn?
I suppose.
Or did she meet somebody else? I'd like to think that she met someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that if it's still only the father's line that's judged to be relevant, then it wouldn't matter that she had been
Mm,
queen. But she's not just queen regent, she's full
mm,
on queen. So you'd think she would become the conduit, is that the word? Who knows?
maybe.
Anyway, I think Gwendolyn should get more of a place. There's a really amazing genealogical roll from the late 13th century that was probably used by Edward I while he was stationed at York, making war against the Scots, trying to become overlord of the Scots. It shows all of the kings of England from Brutus all the way down to Edward I, like a big family tree. I don't think Gwendolyn's on there. I want to check. It's digitized on the Bodleian website, and it's called Bodley Rolls 3. And I remember thinking that was odd that she just gets sort of subtracted,
Mm.
but maybe she is. And maybe we have to check about Cordelia too. Anyway, these stories had huge political relevance. It's really fascinating.
Mm. I was going to ask actually, because obviously I normally look more at folklore, but obviously because I do think folklore, mythology, and legends are three separate things, just
Yeah.
to muddy the waters a bit. So I would qualify these stories as legends or even myths rather than folklore. So do you think that folklore is the same as legends, or do legends have a different quality that kind of makes them something
Mm.
separate?
I guess the medievalists' answer is that legend is from Latin legenda, meaning a to be read thing. So legends were originally applied to saints, stories about saints that were written down to be read and digested and studied. And in the same way, then I think stories of powerful historical or not historical kings were written down, like Alexander the Great, Arthur. I think those end up having a kind of, because you're also expected to read them with a view to emulating their good deeds, perhaps. That idea of legenda, a to be read thing, a legendary thing, starts being applied to secular figures as well. I'm sort of speculating, but I think myths I've always assumed have something to do with political or biological origins. No, biological is the wrong word, but kind of sort of like about creation. There's something original, like originatory about them, whether it's like Kronos eating his children or Brutus founding Britain. And folklore, I've always imagined, has a kind of broadly political, but it's profoundly personal and kind of says something about how obviously there's this sense that it circulates among the people, the folk, whereas myth and legend are perhaps more elite.
Mm.
But also I think there's something like you can take a personal lesson from folklore. It doesn't have a broader political implication necessarily. I don't know, what do you think?
I think I tend to look at them as myths almost seem to have, and I think I was talking about this with one of the guests before, that myths have more of like an established kind. And I know obviously there's different retellings of myths, and if you look at like the Egyptian myths, they change depending on the dynasty, but ultimately they're kind of codified at the top, and then everyone sort of then sticks with like the established version, if that makes sense. Whereas legends, I always kind of feel have a little bit more of a like somebody wrote them down, so they've kind
Yeah,
of got like an origin point. Whereas folklore, because it's of the people and it just kind of goes off into
there's a sort
circulation.
of oral sort of
Yeah.
flexibility to it. Yeah.
So I kind of feel like it's down, how do I put it? It's kind of because it's among people, it's at like the bottom strata where it would be really easily ignored. And
Mm-hmm.
there's not one official version of a lot of folklore because of the fact that look at how much it changes if you just simply go from one part of London to another, even, So
Yeah,
I think
I think
that's
it's
how I see them.
yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting in relation to the medieval stuff because of course they use different words for all of these things. Yeah, and so we're trying to work out how our particular words apply to these things which didn't have the same categories. you can get like Gerald of Wales is the 12th century topography of Wales, which has loads of history. It has loads of animal lore. It has a random story about a priest who talks about when he was a child, he fell through a riverbank and into the land of fairy, which totally like what we would think of as fairy tale folklore. He enters a land that's perpetually twilight, where everybody eats only a milk pudding dyed with saffron, and they've got little horses the size of greyhounds, and he plays with the king's son with a golden ball, all day, and that kind of thing. And yet, Gerald of Wales is a historian, and different ideas about where truth has to lie. So I don't know whether we're it's a fun exercise to be thinking about what we mean by these different words. And then we have to remember that what we're calling myth now was seen as history then. There was confusion then. Gerald of Wales hates Geoffrey of Monmouth. They're writing sort of 40 years apart. Geoffrey of Monmouth went first with his big history of the kings of Britain. A bit later, Gerald of Wales says in his, I think it's his Journey Through Wales, that there's a man who can see demons whenever somebody lies. And he sees, like, if somebody is telling an untruth, there are demons will be dancing all over them. And he said, but when you give him a copy of the Gospel of Luke, there are no demons at all. But when you give him a copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, it's absolutely covered in demons because it's all lies. Gerald of Wales clearly objected to Geoffrey of Monmouth's idea of what history is. History was meant to be. He saw it was full of untruths and fancy and fairy tale giants and goddesses and all of that malarkey. So it's fascinating and complicated.
Yeah, I remember I did the episode about northern vampires, and it was William of Newburgh. So this canon is writing these manuscripts, like a history of Britain, in he's written them in the 12th century, and he just randomly drops these 3 stories of these undead revenants that were plaguing like Berwick, Alnwick, and Melrose, and just drops them into what he's talking about, and then and then he just changes tack to talk about something completely mundane, and it's just like, what? And I love the idea that
so much.
Someone reading it at the time was just like, yeah, that totally happened, and we're like,
there was some study with rats where they were given heroin in their water feeds. I don't know if you've heard about this, and I might have dreamt it. I definitely haven't found this first. I didn't read this, somebody told me, but and they all or something, maybe it wasn't heroin, maybe it was something tasty, I don't know, but there was 3 groups of rats. One had normal water, one had water with something tasty or perhaps heroin in, and one had water that sometimes had heroin in and sometimes didn't. And the rats that had the heroin or something tasty, whatever it was, would not go and experiment to see if it was in there. Whereas the ones where you're sometimes given something good, they were constantly drinking because they were like, maybe this time. It was like the fruit machine. It was like, maybe this time there'll be something good in my water. And somebody said it's the same with social media. We scroll and refresh for likes because sometimes we don't have any likes and sometimes we do. In the same way, when I read a monastic chronicle, I'm just like, you're there like, oh, another dead bishop, oh, another thing about land, oh, vampires, something land. So I find myself addicted to monastic chronicles because of that. You'll be rambling through utter dross or something that's really quite dull from a modern perspective, and then suddenly you get werewolves or a man falling into a riverbank and playing with a golden ball or the undead.
I must admit, a world where you have to eat milk pudding, I mean, it's not the worst thing that could happen to you.
yeah, especially if it's got a bit of brown sugar on it, which I suppose it wouldn't have done in the days before sugarcane, but maybe that like in Europe at least, but although we are in the other world, so maybe they had it.
So this is probably the worst question to ask of a compilation, as it were, like this, but do you have a favorite story in Storyland?
I like different ones for different reasons. One of my favorites is the story of Saint Tenu, who is the mother of Saint Mungo, who is the patron saint of Glasgow. I like it because it's so challenging and it seems so modern initially, because she has run away from her father, the King of Lothian, so that she can be a practicing Christian and she lives in the woods with a swineherd. In fact, I think he's banished her there because she refused. She turned down a suitor called Sir Owain, possibly intended to be understood as the Owain from one of the Knights of the Round Table. And she's been banished to live with a swineherd, but actually she quite likes it because the swineherd's a really nice Christian and they just read the Bible in the evenings, and then she tends the pigs in the day. But then one day she's in the woods and a girl comes up to her and says, "Oh, can you help me carry this big bundle of sticks that I've gathered?" And so she says, "Yes, of course," but she doesn't realize that the girl is actually Sir Owain in disguise. He wreaks his vengeance by attacking her in the forest. This isn't my favorite story because I somehow derived horrible pleasure from this really sad tale, but I think its complexity as a modern reader with certain preconceptions about the Middle Ages is really fascinating, because Sir Owain says to her, "It's okay, you're still a virgin, because I'm a woman, and a woman couldn't violate another woman." And he sort of leaves her there. Presumably she's incredibly confused and traumatized by what's just happened. But she believes what Sir Owain has said, who she still thinks is a girl, and that she's been attacked in this kind of completely inexplicable way, but she's not been sexually violated. So when she realizes she's pregnant a couple of months later, she thinks she's having a virgin pregnancy. Then she sort of has to undergo all kinds of punishments from her father, who thinks who's punishing her for being pregnant out of wedlock, and it includes being sort of cast adrift beside the Isle of May in the Firth of Forth. And so anyway, I went out to the Isle of May and sat on the ferry that takes you out there, and the engines all cut out en route, and we ended up drifting like Tenu. And so for various reasons, I find that story fascinating and touching, and the setting so beautiful all around that part of Scotland. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Cool. Obviously, the thing we haven't really touched on, we've obviously talked about you illustrating the books, but you are an art historian as well. And obviously my first degree was actually in art history, so I'm quite taken with how folklore and myth and so on are represented in art rather than necessarily other cultural forms. Do you think that there can be a tendency to overlook the way that folklore and myth are depicted in art because it's almost like literature seems the obvious choice? Or do you think that with art, you've then got to get over the artist's like visual interpretation of something before you can get anything out of it?
Yeah, I think in some ways imagery might have been how people encountered these stories at a more general level, like the big chalk figures wrestling on Plymouth Hoe. Presumably that was a communal endeavor. When I was doing my PhD, I was particularly interested in illustrations of the brute myth. It's very rarely illustrated in manuscripts. Text is something that's always seen as having primacy over image, and I think that was the same in if we're talking about medieval myths, that was the same in the Middle Ages. The text was the thing that was fixed, and the images would change from version to version. Some of the imagery would reflect the kinds of iconographies that had been used for centuries for religious art, and so that would give them a sense of importance and authority. But there wasn't really a strong tradition for illustrating those kinds of things, whereas the text there was. I guess that when images are exciting in a different kind of way. The manuscript I studied is in the British Library. It's called Egerton Emmus 3028. It's fully digitized, so you can kind of flick through. The text in it is the brute legend, the story of the foundation of Britain, and it's heavily abridged. It's written in Old French or Anglo-Norman French, and it's heavily abridged so that it can be illustrated on every double page spread, because if you've got like pages and pages of dialogue, there's not much to illustrate. So whoever adapted this text just cut the long bits of dialogue, cut the really long description, just goes action, 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 so you can have picture, 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 picture. My personal belief is that it was designed for a young reader, because you're being aided in the reading of the text, and also because it holds your attention. Pictures hold your attention in a different way. So like there's a lovely illustration on folio 41R, if anyone's actually going to go and look this up, of Merlin, the child Merlin, guiding the deconstruction of the stones that will become Stonehenge, and he's sort of standing there beside in front of what is clearly Stonehenge, I've slightly lost my grip on what your actual question was, but my answer to my imagined version of your question, but you can feel free to put the question to me again after I finish, is that that I think we can connect with these sources more powerfully through images. I personally think there's something about images. I found it when I illustrated them and took those illustrations to a literary agency. The rhetorical power of saying, look how great this story is, here's a picture of something cool, versus reading it aloud initially, or kind of describing the story is much more immediate. And I think that's true in the medieval material too.
Mm-hmm. That was basically the question. It was whether you could still represent folklore and myth through art, or whether people overlook art sometimes and instead go straight to the literature.
Yeah,
and I think it can be a shame.
Yeah, I think another point I'd make in that regard is that often if you're illustrating in a certain way, you have to describe things that are not present in the text. So in the text, you can have two people talking and you don't have to say what's in the background. But if you're illustrating in a more kind of in a fairly literal way, you're going to have to make some decisions about whether it's what kind of trees there might be. If it says they're in the woods, for instance, you then have to be like, okay, are we in a deciduous woodland or evergreen? Like, we've got to make some decisions. And there was a really interesting point made by a scholar called David Bernstein about the Bayeux Tapestry and the arrow in the eye of Harold, which is that the early chronicles say Harold dies at Hastings, but it begins being illustrated equally early. And at that point, the artists have to make a decision about how he's going to die. And there's a whole kind of thing around blinding with the story of Edward the Confessor. His brother is blinded by Harold's father, Earl Godwin, and Edward the Confessor heals people who are blind. And then Harold, by sort of the slightly later than within a couple of centuries of the Battle of Hastings, dies at Hastings with an arrow in the eye. And this arrow in the eye has a really good sort of poetic justice to it. But perhaps David Bernstein, I believe, because this is a couple of years ago that I read this, argues that it may have been, or he suggests that it might have been artistic depictions, having to make a decision about how he died, picking the arrow in the eye because that resonated with earlier tropes in the story, that crystallized that particular and now incredibly famous moment, which many people think of as history, but perhaps it was actually the artists and visual representation that brought that into the story.
That'd be interesting.
There is a kind of Chinese whispers to say between text and image.
Yeah, was that when you were describing the one with the images on every double page spread? I'm like, that's almost like an early comic.
Yeah. And they are using the same, their pen and wash, and the pen is using the same ink as the text. So they seem to just grow out. They really like sit with the text. They're so closely related to it. It's quite thrilling. Something you wouldn't get necessarily with a printed book. It's like the text and image are at one with each other, and that's what I hope to achieve with Storyland, by being like the artist and the author, by retelling the stories through text and image, that they're kind of really interdependent and unified.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of the things I noticed was really interesting about Wild, because obviously because I've got the electronic version, so obviously it still has the illustrations and so on. But then in the audiobook version, obviously, how do you depict an image in an audiobook? And then you've got songs instead. And I thought that was such an interesting way of kind of looking at the almost multimedia way that I suppose people would have shared stories in earlier times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think studying the Middle Ages does liberate you as a storyteller. The idea of telling a story to a harp. So there's already like just an assumption of music, I think, in a lot of like you can open like big manuscripts of the legend of or the romance of Alexander the Great, and the first pages of the story have all these figures in the margins with musical instruments. Or one of the earliest manuscripts of Tristan and Isolde, as an English manuscript, shows Isolde playing the harp in an initial just before one of the opening scenes, or one of the scenes describing her. I mean, on those manuscript pages, you have got text, which is a stand-in for speech. I think there's that assumption in medieval manuscripts that we don't have now. We're much more obsessed with private reading, but that's a monastic thing that comes in later, into the general populace later. So there's an assumption of reading aloud, probably to music. And you've also got the art on the page, And so this kind of collaboration of text, image, spoken word, and song or music is sort of ever present when you're a medievalist.
So obviously in Wild, that one you kind of charting the British landscape sort of against the Exeter book. So how would you describe the Exeter book to anyone who's not familiar with it? And what made you choose that one as a source of inspiration among all of the other sources that you could have chosen?
Yeah. I think the English have this tedious habit of thinking they don't have a history, or they don't have like a lot of, I think the problems around English dominance come from the appropriation of other cultures. But then there's a sort of timidity about celebrating past Englishness because it's seen as somehow nationalistic. And I don't know if that's true. And I think that if there are some things that, as English speakers, as people living in England, as things that really are, the Exeter book is one of those documents that's just so incredible. And I think if we lived in another country, it would be on the national curriculum and it'd be fine. You know, maybe I haven't thought this through enough, but it's a 10th century manuscript full of poems in Old English and riddles in Old English that range from stories of kind of heroic hermit saints who battle demons to descriptions of mythical creatures or kind of really weird panthers that are rainbow colored, to really obscene riddles about all kinds of sexual things. And also these amazing poems known as the Old English elegies, which are somewhere between a lament and a riddle. And each one seems to take a very strange, unique psychological situation, like utter loneliness or romantic indecision or lost love or something like that, and sort of couple it with a really compelling description of the wilderness. So it might be being cast adrift on a frozen sea, or being trapped on an island in the fens, or walking through a ruined city. And those wildernesses become a kind of vehicle for the description of the narrator's psychological state. And they're so weird and so beautiful and so dark. And I loved them as a 18-year-old when I first started studying Old English. And it's baffling to me, or it sort of just seems like we're missing an opportunity that we don't share this more with, because for the way it evokes the landscape around us and areas of whatever however close we can get to wilderness now in Britain and in England, those areas like what's left of the fens, how those environments are evoked is so beautiful. I wanted with Wild to introduce the Exeter book to a wider audience, to show that it has interesting relationships as well with Celtic poetry, those kinds of genres, and also celebrate the landscapes of Britain. Yeah.
So that leads in nicely to my last question. Obviously, engaging with folklore has come up time and again on the podcast as being a way to engage with the landscape or the place where people actually are. Do you hope that these two books might actually encourage people to go out into the British landscape, particularly because obviously that's where they're set, and see it with new eyes? Or do you just want to kind of help people gain a bit more of an appreciation for where they live?
Yeah, I think that I don't go past Stonehenge now without thinking that's where Uther Pendragon and Aurelius Ambrosius are buried. I mean, they're not, but I like the telescopic view of places through story, different stories applied at different times. And I think in the case of these books, I know that not all of us are ecologists. We all need to care more about where we live, about the landscape. We all deserve to feel like we belong in the place that we live. And some people do that by knowing all the flora and fauna, by bird watching, by whatever it is. And I'm into that to a certain extent, but I'm not a scientist. But if you have stories associated with that place, and especially stories that begin in Syria or Troy or Greece, these are stories of migration and movement and a certain amount of confusion as well. I think that it brings that landscape to life for a mind that maybe wants more of that, tales of relationship and people, perhaps, and magic, of course. So I think that gives you a sense of quite loving ownership. And I think that's what we increasingly need to have over our wild spaces and our hills, especially places that are really hard to get to, or that you maybe can't get to for whatever reason. If you can imagine Dinas Emrys next to Snowdon, through the story of Vortigern and the crumbling tower, and then something comes up about protection for that particular national park, then you're going to care about it in a different way than if you'd never heard of it and never able to visit it. I don't know. That's my. I've got sort of a vague belief that these stories are good for us, and that it probably won't do any harm in sharing them.
Yeah, it's quite funny because it sort of fits in with some of the other interviews I've been doing this month on Magical October about having that engagement with landscape, or having like an awareness of what ideas, I'll say rather than truth, but what ideas might be in old stories and old legends and so on. So maybe we shouldn't be quite so quick to dismiss everything.
Yeah, I think that these stories show that even hundreds of years ago, people were inspired by these places and enchanted by them. That's a nice sense of connection to have.
I think that's also a nice point to end on as well.
Thank you, AC.
If people want to connect with you online, where would be the best place for people to do that?
Instagram and X, right, as it's now called. So I have recently changed my handle on Instagram to @AmyJeffs_author. I think I've got that right. And on Twitter, I'm Amy_Historia, as in the Latin word for history. And it would be lovely to meet a new one on there. So yes, thank you so much for having me.
It's been fabulous talking to you, and obviously I have enjoyed both books as well, so I will do a separate review episode of them as well.
Thank you so much. Anyway,
it's been lovely talking to you.
Really lovely speaking to you too, and congratulations on Rebel Folklore.
Thank you.
And thank you for letting me write the book forward.
Yeah, it was really funny when your name got put forward. I was like, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. All right, well, I'll speak to you soon, I imagine.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.